Well, it's about that time. I got my microphone on here and we'll get going here in just another minute or so. Hope everybody's doing well. Good to see everybody tuned in here. Well, it's about that time. I got my microphone. Guess I better turn that off, hadn't I? Really don't want to hear myself talk. Everybody having a good week thus far? Leave us a comment or a happy face or a thumbs up or a something to let us know you're having a good week. Appreciate you coming up with us on Wednesday night as we continue our church history study, and the clock has hit. Ooh, I see lots of thumbs up and happy faces. That's awesome. Awesome. That's great. Well, this is week 3 of our journey through the swinging 60s. The crazy 1960s, week 3. We've spent the last 2 weeks setting up the political environment, the social environment, thinking about justice and thinking about just the circumstance for which the racial tension in America is about ready to boil over. And so that's where we are tonight. And if you think about the civil rights movement, the most intense, the most convulsive aspects of the civil rights movement happened between 1955, when police officers arrested Rosa Parks in Montgomery, Alabama, for refusing to give up her seat on a city bus to a white man, and then the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. at the Lorraine Hotel in Memphis in 1968. I use those two events not only because they sort of chronologically bookend, but both of those events are directly tied to maybe the most famous person in the 1960s to come out of Churches of Christ, a man named Fred Gray, and we'll talk about him in just a little while. All sorts of things happen in these events, the most revolutionary things, maybe going back as far as the Civil War in America. But if the only source of information that you got your news from was the Gospel Advocate or the Firm Foundation, you might as well have not known anything else was going on. Because as you read through those mainstays that were voices of communicating what was going on in Churches of Christ, they were almost silent when it came to race relations, to racism. We're going to unfold that and talk about that a little bit more tonight. Let me remind you about the Herald of Truth. We've talked about that a lot in the last few weeks because it was a really important place in our history. But one of the Herald of Truth speakers was a man named James Williford, and he has been described as sort of a voice crying in the wilderness, to use the prophetic language of Isaiah and Amos and Micah, because he was one of the few who was speaking out against racism. But he was doing it on radio broadcasts as early as 1955. When we get into the 70s, and Batsell Barrett Baxter is an important name, and others who will follow him, we'll see that they are involved in those conversations as well, especially the unity meeting that takes place in Atlanta in 1968. But we'll talk about that more when we get there. But Williford was more the exception than the rule. Andrew Hairston, who was a prominent minister in Atlanta at the Simpson Street Church, was very outspoken and lamented in 1963 that the white press, especially in Churches of Christ, for the most part, had been as silent as the grave. To a great degree, that silence was an indicator of the distance that black Churches of Christ and white Churches of Christ had become two very different churches. And we've talked about that last week, going back as far as Stone's opinion about slavery and Lipscomb's outspokenness about the abhorrence of refusing membership to someone because they were people of color. But there was, with rare exception, and Hairston wrote about this in 1964, in every town there's the white church and the black church. And these churches, were separate and apart, to use different Church of Christ-y language. Blacks had their own bishop in the editor of the Christian Echo, which started in 1902 with G.P. Bowser. They had their own lectureships, they had their own gospel meetings, they had their own crusades, they had their own college in Southwestern Christian College in Terrell, which opened in 1950. And in 1950, a man by the name of W.E. Brightwell, who was the news and notes editor of the Gospel Advocate, he estimates around 1948 that there were more than 1,000 black congregations in the U.S. If you go up to 1990, when Mac Lynn was just beginning to publish his Directory of Churches of Christ in the United States, sort of the authoritative record on that said that there were, almost 13 or 1,400 of those. 1,218, I think, was his official number. But the effect that this separation had, the sting of the segregation, even to the point of, call it unintentional, call it, whatever you want to call it, it was two separate churches, black churches and white churches. The sting of segregation felt by our black brothers and sisters is further reflected in the fact that they sometimes counted their membership only in terms of black members. It's just reinforcing so much of this. A man by the name of V.L. Cathy, and I don't know any more information about him other than what Richard Hughes offers in his book, Reviving the Ancient Faith. In 1965, he wrote that black churches had a church membership of more than 40,000 members, and that should allow Southwestern Christian College to be accredited in America any day. Well, you think about it, white churches didn't know much about the black church and its para-church organizations, its institutions, its arms, its reach, what it was interested in. This was on the Christian Chronicle in 1968. They wrote this: the average white member of a local church knows less about his Negro fellow Christians than he does about local politics or the latest television heroes. There have been indeed two separate brotherhoods within their own leaders, schools, missionaries, lectureships, and geographical areas of strength. Even the white churches, who have supported Negro mission work and building projects, are largely unaware of life on the other side of the, quote, middle of the wall partition. And that's from, what was viewed as a more quote-unquote progressive, middle-of-the-road journal that was different than the Gospel Advocate, Firm Foundation, Bible Banner, Gospel Guardian, all of those with origins in the institutional controversies going back to the days of Wallace and others. But for us to understand the history and the traditions that have coexisted separately between white churches of Christ and African American churches of Christ, we have to go back to these two guys. We've talked about G.P. Bowser and we've talked about Marshall Keeble. We've talked about Marshall Keeble's humility and willingness to endure scorn and institutional racism for the sake of the support that he garnered from a number of white congregations who were willing to support him despite the stigma, as we talked about last week. And I don't mean to harp, but on Foy Wallace, who's one who said in 1948, well, blacks ought to preach to black audiences and whites ought to stay away, and vice versa. And Keeble was so humble that he would preach wherever he was asked, and often his audiences were mixed of white and black. And then there's G.P. Bowser, who was quite outspoken about institutional racism. And they both tread different paths because of that. Keeble, to some degree reflected a dependence on white paternalism. But throughout the century, black churches also developed, separate independent traditions that were capable of launching harsh critiques against white racism. This was G.P. Bowser, and as we've talked about, he was the voice behind that. When we talk about black churches and white churches, there are these leading voices, and within these leading voices, there are often a group or a tribe or a bullpen of younger preachers who are sitting at the feet of these leaders, whether that was Foy Wallace, whether that was, R.H. Bowl, or even going back to Campbell and Stone and Scott and Lipscomb and Isaac Errett and all those other guys at the turn of the 20th century. Bowser and Keeble were viewed by the outside as having, quote unquote, their group of preachers, their boys, Bowser's boys and Keeble's boys, that they were training up to be the next generations of leaders. And I want to talk about some of those who were amongst the mentorship of G.P. Bowser, because even though he has been sort of labeled and cast aside with a more negative voice, his influence on the men who he mentored has been undeniably huge in our movement. And I'm talking about people like J.S. Winston and R.N. Hogan, whose pictures you see up here, Levi Kennedy and G.E. Stewart. The Christian Echo was a journal that Bowser started in 1902, and he wanted to use it to mobilize and unify black churches for the remainder of the century. Throughout the civil rights struggle in the 1960s, R.N. Hogan, who was one of Bowser's students at the Silver Point Christian Institute, where he taught and sort of was the corollary to the Nashville Bible School, which we'll talk about in a moment, he took over the editorship of the Christian Echo and made it the principal voice of protest in the civil rights movement in churches of Christ. And despite the fact that Keeble and Bowser were different and they had different traditions, both of them were significant in contributing to the mindset, the theology, the practice, and the way black churches of Christ in the U.S. have operated and have functioned. Sorry. Another person that they depended on was a very early leader in the 1880s, Samuel R. Cassius. Was one of the earliest black leaders in the Stone Campbell movement, and you can see his dates. I mean, he overlaps with Campbell and with Stone, or at least with Alexander Campbell. As early as 1915, Cassius, who was by far a more holistic thinker about the Bible, different than Campbell in that he viewed the entirety of the canon as important as opposed to just the Acts 2 forward. As early as 1915, Cassius complained that he was seeing that black churches were seldom moving beyond what he called first principles. And I think this is so interesting. He says we're teaching too much faith, repentance, confession, and baptism, and not enough grace, love, truth, and mercy. That is telling, because that is not just the case for black churches at this time. This is absolutely the same as we were seeing in white churches. In some ways, Cassius was saying we have embraced this rationalism, this legalism, this legalistic approach to Scripture that Campbell helped to shape in the way we think about it. But nevertheless, it's going to be really, really important for sort of setting the table for how black churches operate. We think about colleges, and my slides are a little bit out of order here. Yeah, I see the comment about the background. This is the same background we've had since the beginning. I'm sorry if it's something that you can't see real well. Let's talk a little bit about colleges for a second. One of the things that reflects the height of the struggle of racism and churches of Christ is the struggle for integrated colleges, and how can a Christian institution read Scripture and somehow reconcile that we can't admit people of a different skin color into our colleges. Well, this was one place where the war on civil rights was waged between 1955 and 1968. There are a number of things we can look at, from the ACU yearbook using racist cartoons in the 1920s and 30s, to Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. A man, well shoot, I did have them in the right order. Y'all just pretend I'm not here. A man by the name of Hubert Locke, who would become a really important voice in Detroit during the race riots in 1960. He would become a highly respected dean and professor of law at the University of Washington. At the time of the race riots, he was the assistant police commissioner, which was unheard of, that a Church of Christer would rise that high in society, let alone the racist tension that were existing. He preached to the Conant Garden Church in Detroit. But in 1965, he talked about how churches of Christ, for the most part, have remained a religious symbol of all that is distasteful about the Southern way of life. Our leading Southern educational institutions on the grounds that all but one refused to admit African Americans. He said, there are no Negro children admitted to our church-related orphanages. There are no Negro residents admitted to our Church of Christ homes for the aged. And he concluded by saying this, which is another telling statement. We are the only major religious body in America. And remember, we've talked about the journey from sort of a group that was viewed as a back burner group to, throughout the late 50s and early 60s, now being a leading voice in the movement. We are the only major religious body in America whose voice has not been raised in the present conflict on the side of racial equality. What does that say? What does that say about the division between blacks and whites in our churches? What does it say about our movement? What does it say about our focus? Well, there were a whole host of black Christians who refused to accept that this was compatible with being a believer. We talked about Andrew Hairston from Atlanta earlier. He talked about how segregation had devoured the true church and nearly convinced the world that the existence of the true Church of Christ has to continue to be prayed for and hoped for because it sure hasn't shown itself yet. Wow. R.N. Hogan, who was one of Bowser's disciples, was one of the harshest and most outspoken critics and really unrelenting about how this was seeing itself and it's rearing its ugly head in our churches. And he edited the Christian Echo, and so that was a platform for him. But he talks about how he grieved because blacks were admitted to denominational schools as well as state schools, but they can't enter a Christian school operated by members of the Church of Christ? That's a strong question. He argued time and time again that those who ran these schools should stop calling themselves Christians, stop calling their schools Christian schools, and stop calling their churches churches of Christ, because what they were doing wasn't scriptural. It wasn't congruent with the picture that Jesus painted of acceptance and of what the church was called to look like. And so 1960 arrives, this struggle continues, but it finds an ally. And it finds an ally at Abilene Christian College named Carl Spann. An ACU professor, he was an ally against racism. He was a revered teacher and preacher. He was the preacher of the Hillcrest Church in Abilene at the time. And at the ACC lectures in 1960, he was the first white voice among churches of Christ to speak out on a major platform against not just the separation of congregations, black churches and white churches, but against racism altogether. In talking about the slowness and the unwillingness of churches of Christ to speak out against it, this is what he said. And I tried to find a recording of this today and just did not have a lot of luck because I'd much rather you hear the passion of Spain's voice than mine. But listen to what he says. God forbid that churches of Christ and schools operated by Christians should be the last stronghold of refuge for socially sick people who have Nazi illusions about the master race. I feel certain that Jesus would say, "Ye hypocrites! You say you are the only true Christians and make up the only true church and have the only Christian schools. Yet you drive one of your own preachers to denominational schools where he can get credit for his work and refuse to let him take Bible for credit in your own school because the color of his skin is dark." Why are we afraid? Are we moral cowards on this issue? There are people with money who will back us in our last-ditch stand for white supremacy in a world of pigmented people. And here's the rest of that quote. God forbid that we should be the last stronghold among religious schools where the politico-economic philosophy of naturalism determines our moral conduct. And as you can imagine, many people in Gospel Advocate and Firm Foundation and the Christian Echo and everywhere that would reprinted his speech in full. It was landmark, and it was received well on some sides and not so well on others, and that's among both white and black churches. Hogan was so thrilled that he had found an ally and a voice who was willing to speak out. Others thought, well, this is just a facade. This is just ACC's attempt to placate, to get more money, to get more, etc., etc. Well, Spain was blacklisted by half of our churches, as you might imagine. There were strong critics of his speech, but his speech evoked strong, broad-based support from the administration at ACC, the faculty, the students, in such that it began to admit blacks to its graduate school in 1961 and its undergrad programs in 1962. And there are varying reports on why they decided to take that long. Still, I come back to Hogan, whose voice is such an important voice. Yes, Carl, you're right. Those Carls are leading the way. Hogan praised Spain and lifted him up, but he said ACC deserves praise for its actions, but he says in a scolding rebuke of the other schools, it's almost an insult for a Negro to ask to be admitted into David Lipscomb College in Nashville, Tennessee, yet it's supposed to be operated by Christians. What reason can David Lipscomb, Harding, Freed Hardeman, Florida Christian, and other such schools who are refusing to allow Negroes to be trained in their schools give for such practice but sheer prejudice and hate? He talked about how especially ironic it was in the school that bore Lipscomb's name, Lipscomb, the one who was quick to condemn racism in churches, was among the last to recognize it and do something about it. By 1963, this is where I had those out of order, but by 1963, Harding admitted African Americans and had integrated. Lipscomb followed suit in 1964. Still, there were some leaders among black churches that suspected integration in some of these colleges was nothing more than a feeble attempt by colleges and by government threats to cut off federal funding if you don't do it. Well, if you don't follow up, and you're probably thinking, okay, there are scenes of George Wallace and John F. Kennedy and that struggle, and Ole Miss and the University of Alabama, and those struggles for the first admittance. But there are some critics within the movement, some leaders, even as late as 1969, who suspected, like G.P. Holt, that he was not impressed by this facade of integration. And he says, when some college president or dean or representative of a Christian college, tells black brethren, look at us, we're not segregated. We have 10 black students out of our 3,000 students. See, we love you, we know you, and we know God knows that our colleges have not had a change of heart, but the government of our land is responsible for these students, these black students, entering in to the white colleges. And so this is going to continue to be a struggle. This tension, this segregation, and this tension between black churches and white churches is just so significant. Let me talk about another case study for this period of time that illustrates part of the struggle. We've talked briefly about the Nashville Christian Institute, which was an institution that was devoted to serving blacks in Churches of Christ from 1941 to 1967. It goes all the way back to 1919. The two people in this picture are A.M. Burton, who is standing with the shovel next to Marshall Keeble. Burton, who was a multi-millionaire who founded the Life and Casualty Insurance Company of Nashville, Randy Cooper and Larry Clemens, insurance guys, you might find that interesting, was a key voice and a key benefactor of Marshall Keeble. Burton started by persuading G.P. Bowser to move to Nashville, to leave his ministry in Louisville, Kentucky, to help him with the new school. Unfortunately, the person that Burton had selected as the first president of the Institute, as we've talked about a few weeks ago, was a man named C.E.W. Doris, and said that the blacks had to enter the back door of this institute, and that was not received well by Bowser, so he quit, and everybody left and went home. So that didn't go well. Still, this group raised money. The institute's people who were constituents and who were driven in providing this institution that would offer elementary through college education for black students, raised the money, chiefly from within the black community of Churches of Christ, bought property, and opened the Nashville Christian Institute in 1941 with an all-black board of directors. Sometime in the next 2 years, a number of white people were added to the board. Others who were in strategic leadership positions at Lipscomb joined the board as well, including Athens Clay Pullius, who was the president of Lipscomb, and others, including A.M. Burton, who's in the picture here. Over the years, Burton is believed to have contributed between $500,000 and $1 million into the Nashville Christian Institute. He died in 1966, and he was the chief benefactor. By 1967, the facility had fallen into disrepair. Teachers were receiving salaries that were half of what teachers in the city's public school were making. Enrollment dropped down after being as high from almost 700 in 1948 to a low of 138 in 1967. And so the board, with enrollment going low and facilities that were falling apart, decided in 1967 to close the school and transfer all of its financial assets, which were about $500,000, to the Burton Keeble Scholarship Fund at Lipscomb College. Some people, like Marshall Keeble, agreed that this was the right thing to do. Keeble is quoted as saying, "While Sister Keeble and I regret to see Nashville Christian Institute close her doors, we wholly support what we thought had to be done." But we come back to others like R.N. Hogan, who felt like this was a betrayal. And so they filed a suit in federal court in 1966 seeking an injunction against the board of the Nashville Christian Institute. Now, this is where one of those names that I mentioned earlier becomes really important again. The lawyer that the students sought to represent the plaintiffs was the same lawyer who represented Rosa Parks in federal court in the 1950s over her refusal to give up her seat on the bus. It's the same lawyer who would be Martin Luther King Jr.'s lawyer for a number of years, and that man was a preacher named Fred Gray. Fred Gray, who preached in Churches of Christ all over the country. Well, the suit claimed that Lipscomb, which had a history of refusing to accept graduates of the Nashville Christian Institute, now was seeking to close the Nashville, and this is Gray with Rosa Parks, and that's Gray sitting next to Martin Luther King Jr. Sought to close the Nashville Christian Institute for the purpose of enriching David Lipscomb College Foundation and the college itself. There were a whole group of people who thought the issues are clear. He maintained Nashville Christian Institute had been built with money given by black members of Churches of Christ, some of whom were on pensions and a very meager means to ensure that young Negro boys and girls could receive an education in a wholesome Christian environment. That this changed over time. Well, in the end, the court denied the effort to serve and secure an injunction against the board. And really, it only caused another wedge between black and white churches. As late as 1990, the late Dr. Jack Evans, who was the president of Southwestern Christian College in Terrell, said that because the institute was closed against the will of many from black Churches of Christ, a feeling of injustice and unfairness still exists today. And so that's Fred Gray, who is one of the most well-respected voices of civil rights in American history. Well, I'll come back to this picture in a moment. Well, as we approach 1968, the social climate in the race riots in Detroit in 1967, the murder of Emmett Till, the Montgomery bus boycott, federal troops in Little Rock, Arkansas enforcing integration, race riots at the University of Mississippi, attacks on freedom riders who integrated buses in the South, the March on Selma, riots in Birmingham, the murder of 4 black children in Sunday school in Birmingham, the murders of 4 young civil rights workers in Mississippi, the assassination of Medgar Evers, the March on Washington in 1963, the assassination of Malcolm X, and then the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. All of these things happened inside of a decade. And I cannot imagine, neither do I pretend to understand the weight of those events and their effects on our churches. But in this period of time, voices who you see in this picture rose to lead. Voices like Andrew Hairston and Zebedee Bishop and Roosevelt Wells and Floyd Rose, Franklin Florence and G.P. Holt, Eugene Lawton, Humphrey Fouts, Hogan, Hubert Locke. All of these criticized segregated churches and segregated church-related institutes, as well as blacks and whites who endured this long-lasting struggle over the events of the Nashville Christian Institute. But with few exceptions, pardon me, the mainstream press that served Churches of Christ did not respond to these issues. It was a deafening silence, as Hairston and Bishop and others would say. Gospel Advocate maintained a silence well into 1968. And you might think, well, they had to do something to respond to the death of Martin Luther King Jr. No, they didn't. They didn't even acknowledge it. The only reason that 1968 brought any kind of response from the Gospel Advocate was because Marshall Keeble died in 1968 as well. And I didn't put this into the slide, so forgive me. I'll try to make this nice and big where you can see it. And that's a little bit too big. And now I can't find my mouse. Y'all just pretend I'm not here. Yeah, May 2, 1968, the Gospel Advocate recognizes the death of Marshall Keeble and dedicated an entire issue to his memory. In September and October, there were 2 articles penned by Batzel Barrett Baxter, the preacher at the Hillsborough Church in Nashville, the influential Herald of Truth speaker, that dealt with prejudice. But it did not directly deal with the issue and almost goes unnoticed because it seems so trivial in light of the bigger picture for what's going on. Firm Foundation remained silent about King and about discrimination when it followed Gospel Advocate, only for the sake of keeping up with the Joneses, some reflected later in life, in taking note of Marshall Keeble's passing. Rule Lemons, who was the editor of the Firm Foundation, even created an incredible storm of controversy and protest because and we could read I could read his quote to you, but I'm not going to do that because I don't think it's worth reading, to be quite honest. But Lemons essentially said Keeble had never suffered from discrimination. Churches of Christ were free from racial prejudice, and that Keble was just a great preacher. Well, this incensed many people. A preacher by the name of Norman Adamson. Man, my tongue is getting all kind of tied and tangled tonight. Maybe it's because talking about this is not easy. But Adamson wrote a letter to the Firm Foundation, an African-American preacher, wrote it to numerous other benefactors of the Firm Foundation, with the result of it being printed on the front page. I have searched myself deeply, trying to decide if this editorial, speaking of where Lemons faultily described Keble's experience, if the editorial is based on your own unbelievable racism or just your gross ignorance on the conditions that have existed and still exist in the church for years. Another important person, Howard White, who was the dean of undergraduate studies at Pepperdine at the time, writes to Lemons to say, Keble was the victim of nothing but discrimination most of the time. White taught at Lipscomb as well, and he's a Caucasian white man who would be a Pepperdine president, I think. If not president, he was an important leader at Pepperdine. But this is what Howard White wrote about Keble. Marshall Keble came every year to speak at the lectures during the 5 years I taught at David Lipscomb College. Not once was he invited to come to a luncheon or to a dinner or to do anything else beyond just speaking. His students and associates from the Nashville Christian Institute were segregated in one corner of the balcony. Because of his great and generous spirit, Brother Keble suffered all these indignities in silence and without any observable resentment. Well, this civil rights struggle, as it's rearing its head in the lack of response from the two major publications and major benefactors in churches of Christ, is only polarizing black and white churches all the more. It showed, that churches of Christ had separated social action from the super individualized conversion that goes all the way back to Campbell. And more so, the civil rights movement, as it expressed itself, revealed the extent to which most mainstream churches of Christ continued to just champion this southern predominant law and order conservative politic value in the face of civil unrest with racial tension, alongside a growing nationwide tension over the escalation in the war that's going to be taking place and that is already taking place in Vietnam. Well, the Firm Foundation continues to separate itself and cause tension. Rule Lemons and James Bales at Harding compare Martin Luther King Jr. And say he's a communist and say that he's being nothing more than a communist. If you've seen any of the biopics about the Kennedys, it portrays J. Edgar Hoover as being central to contributing to conspiracy theories about Martin Luther King Jr. You can read any host of books about the political side of this on your own time, all the way through President Johnson and Nixon and civil rights legislation and all that stuff. But there is nothing but tension getting wider and wider between whites and blacks. Only one response in the immediate wake of Martin Luther King's assassination is noted as being a significant event. A man by the name of John Allen Chalk, who would be a preacher for the Herald of Truth. He would be the preacher for the Highland Church in Abilene. Was already a featured preacher on the Herald of Truth broadcast. led a student gathering on the campus of Oklahoma Christian College, where he eulogized Martin Luther King Jr. And after his address, he led the students in singing "We Shall Overcome." A journal in Fort Worth gets wind of this, and the editor of that journal, wrongly might I add, hymnologically speaking, tries to say that "We Shall Overcome" was written by someone who had been identified under oath as an FBI undercover agent who was working for the Communist Party. Well, you can imagine that that was not received very well. And one of those young black preachers named Humphrey Fouts, who was in Baltimore, a place right in the middle of the political side of all of this thing, wrote a letter to John Allen Chalk saying, "I have been hoping and praying against hope for the changes that must come to come peacefully." Then this kind of lunacy, speaking of the editor of the Christian Journal out of Fort Worth, this kind of lunacy reminds you and shakes you back to the harsh reality of our time. Most in churches of Christ, who were in black churches of Christ at the time of the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., were convinced that people didn't have a clue of the issues that were driving the civil rights movement. If you were to distill down the issues between black churches and white churches, blacks saw mainstream white churches as being more concerned with law and order than with issues of social justice. The response of Churches of Christ, Richard Hughes says, to the civil rights movement and to Martin Luther King Jr. simply compounded the problems that had troubled relationships between blacks and whites in churches for many, many years. Well, the trouble continues, and this takes us to 1968. And in numerous books, Hughes, Leroy Garrett, and others, they talk about 1968 as being a year where for the first time there were signs of change. There was concern within white churches, a minority, who felt strongly about the lack of response that they were called to as Christians to respond to the social justice and racial injustice. I mention this one because I count him as a friend and a former professor. But Dr. John Willis, longtime beloved professor at Abilene Christian in 1967, he was teaching at David Lipscomb, and he was a speaker on the Lipscomb Lectures in 1967, and he publicly challenged and said that white people should have their separate buildings for worship, and that he challenged the notion that white people should have their separate buildings and Negroes should have theirs. You would think that as late as 1967, a message like that would be received well. Well, it drew some affirmation, but ultimately it led to John Willis resigning and his leaving Lipscomb in the face of all of that. And, without that happening, he doesn't end up at ACU, and I don't get the blessing of having him finding me on campus to give me cookies on my birthday, 45 years later. But aside from individuals like John Willis, the greatest impetus for change came from a series of invitation-only underground meetings prompted by white Christians underground in Nashville in 1966. A man by the name of Walter Birch, and Walter's in this picture somewhere, and maybe right there. No, there he is, right there. Walter Birch, who was a public relations consultant living in Abilene. George Gerganis, who was a professor at Harding Graduate School in Memphis. Ira North, who preached at Madison. Dwayne Evans, who was preaching for the Church of Christ in West Islip, New York, and John Allen Chalk were the voices in these meetings. This is an image of all those who attended the first meeting in 1966. This is Jimmy Allen right here, who just passed away, a longtime professor at Harding, sitting next to Roosevelt Wells. Ira North's in there somewhere. John Stevens, right behind John Stevens is Jim Bill McIntyre, and just a host of important voices. And Dwayne Evans, or Walter Birch rather, was a significant person in talking about these meetings. A meeting follows in 1968, and this may actually be the picture from the 1968 meeting. And I'm going to stop there because it's 10 minutes till, and this is a lot to process, and this meeting is so important and has such long-lasting effects that I don't want us to rush through it. But this is these underground meetings that began in Nashville at the urging of Birch and North and Evans and Chalk and David Jones from Schrader Lane in Nashville, which is no longer there. And this gathering, that looks like that might be Fred Gray in that picture, was so important for the hope of reigniting any hope of racial reconciliation. So I'm going to pause there. I want to thank all of you for logging on and for your positive comments and your thumbs up. We're going to continue our journey. We're getting close to being the end of the 60s, but we're not done yet. But there's still work to be done. And right here in Gilmer, Texas, there's work to be done for racial reconciliation. And I don't know what that looks like, but I think God is calling us to be on the forefront of that. So let us be prayerful and hopeful for continued strides in biblical directions for unifying Christians, regardless of what their skin color is. All right, God bless you. We'll talk to you soon. Hope to see you Sunday live and in person at 10 o'clock. We will talk to you soon.